This talk was recorded for St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father Richard Sweeney.
We'd like to welcome you back then again this evening to our sojourn into the late years of the adult life. And I think we can begin by saying that tonight we're really going to look at those years about which I think we know the least. It's those years about which I know the least, since I haven't quite gotten into those years yet. And it's really those years of the adult life cycle where the research starts to get a little bit sketchy. And yet I think there are some things that we have learned that a number of theorists are suggesting, so we'll certainly get into that tonight. You may recall that in talking about these spiritual tasks, we said that every one of these spiritual tasks we've looked at has something to do with one of the three components of the life structure, namely the component of work, profession, or career, or the component of love, relationship, and family, or the third component of vocation and religious meaning. And I mention that tonight as we begin because it's especially in the late years that that third component starts to loom large, namely the whole issue of vocation, of finding a sense of religious meaning in one's life. And we'll see that the tasks, the spiritual tasks of the late years begin to reveal whether or not a person has given too much time and too much energy to those other two life components. So we're going to see much more attention tonight on that sense of vocation or religious meaning. I'd also like to say, by way of introduction, that even though we don't have a lot of research about these late years, obviously this is increasingly becoming the phase of the adult life cycle that in the ensuing years is going to get more and more and more attention. For example, I'd like to share with you just one small statistic. And it has to do with the changing lifespan. The average length of an adult life today has changed drastically since the turn of the centuries, as I think we all know. For example, in the turn of the century, 1900, do you have any idea of what the average lifespan would have extended to? For men in the year 1900, the average length of lifespan was 47. Yeah, and for women, it was 50. Now, 80 years later, these are statistics that go back to 1981. In 1981, the average length of life for an adult was 74, which is almost double, not quite obviously, but close to that. For men, the average length of life was 71, and for women, 78. So, the length of our lives has grown drastically in the last 80 years, and therefore there are more and more people obviously living well into these late years. In addition to that, most statistics suggest that around the year 2000, so roughly 14 years from now, there will be 35 million people in the United States over 65. 35 million, and that's why we're worried about Social Security these days. Plus, in 50 years after that, by the year 2050, estimates are that that number will have doubled, that there very likely will be 70 million people in the United States over 65. So, the significance of these late years is going to become more and more paramount as we move into the next century. So obviously we need to give a good bit of attention to what we might expect in these late years. Now, I would like to preface our reflection on 5 spiritual tasks of these years tonight by trying to at least characterize, however generally, the crisis of the late years, if you will, or what some people are euphemistically calling elderhood. Now, what is the real nature of this? You may recall that we said all of the spiritual tasks that we will have looked at are brought about by a change in my life. Something changes in me and or in my environment, and because of that change, there's something new I have to do. Now, what is the change that seems to affect all of the tasks of the late years? Well, the change is both biological and sociological. First of all, biologically or physically, I begin to experience diminishing health, and energy. So certainly a biological or physical reality of the late years, which we're going to put 60 and on, is that physically I experience diminishing health and diminishing energy. Obviously so. But secondarily, and I personally think more significantly, sociologically what's happening to me in my life is that more and more and more I am moving to the periphery of society. In a host of different ways, I'm no longer in the mainstream in terms of family raising, in terms of my work life, and I begin to find myself more and more on the periphery of things, or at least it feels that way. So, how do we summarize all of that? So the essence of the crisis in these years is this. At the very time in one's life when a person is experiencing diminishing energy and diminishing health, they have to deal with major change with respect to job, housing, and status. So usually a person moves out of the job where they have spent most of their life. They no longer see themselves as full-time employed or employed at all. Major change in the sense of one's place in life. Secondly, and very interestingly, most people in the late years move out of the house where they may have spent most of their lives and maybe raised their families, and suddenly they're living in an apartment or perhaps a retirement home. So there's a major psychological shift involved in moving from the place where I lived most of my life. And then lastly, they also experience a change in terms of status. I don't feel as centrally important in the lives of others as I used to. The reality of things. So, and those are three very major psychological and social and emotional changes. And at the very time I have to deal with those, I have less energy and less health. Hence, we have the crisis of the late years. Now, you may recall we've said all along that the crisis is not catastrophe at all. I feel that way. But it really is turning point. It's the experience that some things are shifting or changing in my life. And if I can make the appropriate adjustments, then the result will be growth. And that's true also of these late years. If I can face the crisis I'm experiencing and make the appropriate decisions, accomplish the necessary tasks, growth will be the result. Okay, so that at least might sketch out for us, however, so generally, the crisis, if you will, that sort of stands over the late years of life. Now, I want to suggest tonight that in talking about the late years, tentatively, we're talking about the years 60 and on. And the theme that I would like to give to all of the spiritual tasks of these late years is this. It is the theme of letting go and living on. Letting go and living on. So all of the tasks that I'm going to confront in these late years has something to do with letting go of something so that I might live on more fully and more completely. Now that dynamic is not new. We've seen it in some of the other tasks throughout the life cycle, but it especially characterizes the tasks of the late years, letting go and living on. I also want to say that the tasks we're going to look at, in my opinion, are not absolutely unique to the late years of life. In many respects, I think some of us experienced these earlier. However, they are tasks that will especially need to be wrestled with and performed in the late years if I am to grow in freedom, in wisdom, and in love. Okay. The first task then I'd like to look at with you tonight is this task: to establish a sense of self-worth apart from externals. Critical task of the late years of one's life. I need to be able to establish for myself, to develop for myself a sense of my own self-worth, my own value as a person that is not related to externals in my life. In other words, it's not connected to my work or to accomplishments or to positions that I have held and maybe wish I still held, nor is it related to my physical strength or prowess or attractiveness. None of that becomes the basis of my sense of self-worth. And why? Well, obviously because many of these things are fading or have faded from my life. I may not be in the job that I had most of my life. I don't have the title or the position that I used to have. I'm not physically as healthy or as athletic. I don't see myself as attractive as I once did. So all of the things that used to give me a sense of my own worth as a person are fading a bit. And so the task is to have a sense, to establish a sense of my self-worth apart from all of that. I find it interesting that one study that was done a few years ago on depression in the lives of elderly people concluded that the main cause of depression in the lives of elderly people is essentially inferiority and a lack of self-esteem. The inability to esteem myself or to feel that I have some value as a person. And I would suggest very likely because the things that my self-worth were hooked to have faded in my life. And when they fade, I begin to lose a sense of my own worth as a person. So what a person needs to do, not only at this phase of one's life, but I think throughout the life cycle, but especially now, is to be able to value being more than doing. To value being more than doing. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that I really begin to believe that it's more important to be a certain kind of person than it is to do many significant, valuable things. And I begin to become more and more convinced of the fact that if I simply am a person filled with the Spirit who is free, who is reasonably wise, who is loving, then my life will be powerfully effective, even if I cannot do many of the things I used to do before. So it becomes critical to begin to be able, in that sense, to value being more than doing. Something, frankly, which our society doesn't help us with a lot, because we tend to be rewarded in society much more for doing things than for being a certain kind of person. But that is fundamentally a task that needs to be negotiated in these late years. Now, you may recall we've said before that to the extent that I'm unable to negotiate some of those earlier life tasks, it will become difficult for me to negotiate later ones. And I think this is a classic example. If I've never really negotiated that task of establishing my identity early in life, then I will have trouble negotiating this task. If my identity was too hooked to something else in my life, to success or to accomplishment or to acceptance from others, then I may have difficulty having a sense of self-worth late in life. And I think many of us struggle with that issue through most of our lives. But it's a great example of how an unresolved early task comes home to haunt us a bit in the late years. Now, I'd like to share with you one example of this task, and it's a reference to a play with which I suspect many of you are familiar. It's a play that some people would consider the best American tragedy that was ever written, Death of a Salesman, by Arthur Miller, that you might be familiar with. It's a great example of precisely this issue, I think. The play tells the story of Willie Loman, traveling salesman. And the play opens right after he has learned that he has lost his job and is being invited into early retirement. And notice the play is the death of a salesman, not the death of Willie Loman, the death of a salesman. It's the death of a person whose whole identity was hooked to his role as a salesman. Now, Willie Loman cannot see that there are other possibilities now opening up in his life. His wife is thinking that maybe this will be a chance for them to begin to restore their relationship, which has been troubled over the years. His sons are hoping maybe now that they'll get a chance to get to know their father who's been on the road all these years. His one son, Biff, is anxious that maybe they can work out some of the problems that they've wrestled with over the years. So here are all these other options available to work on other components of the life structure. But Willie Loman can't see them. His sense of self-worth is connected to his job, to his success as a salesman. And if you know the play, you know that what he finally chooses to do is to end his own life, to commit suicide. And I believe the whole play is really captured very well in one of the last lines. They're standing at the grave site, and Willie Loman's son, Biff, is standing over the grave, and he just shakes his head and says, "The man never knew who he was. He never knew who he was. Never really found his identity. Never really had a sense of self-worth apart from being a salesman." And so obviously he could not negotiate this task in the late years of his life. So, one task that does befall us is to establish a sense of self-worth apart from externals in our lives. Now, that leads to a second task which in many ways I believe flows out of the first. And the second task that I would suggest is to freely surrender dimensions of life that are no longer available to me. And notice the word freely. To freely let go of and to surrender dimensions of life that really are no longer available to me, so that I can embrace the ones that are. Letting go so that I might live on. Now, I believe that this is an eminently spiritual theme, and I think the image from our Christian tradition that captures it best is this image of the dark night that St. John of the Cross talks about. I believe I've mentioned that in earlier sessions. St. John of the Cross says that as we go through our lives, our spiritual lives, a couple of times we can expect to encounter what he calls a dark night. And by a dark night, he means an experience of loss where what used to give me meaning and gratification does no longer. What used to support me in my life, it might have been success, it might have been the approval of others, it might have been a particular person, it might have been an image of God, it might have been certain hopes or dreams. It begins to fall away. I can no longer possess it. And I begin to experience loss and darkness. And all I can do is let go of it and not try to possess what is now no longer able to be possessed. And I think the difficulty is that what I'm letting go of is always good. It's not something that was bad, it was good, but it can be retained no longer. And so I have to let go of it. And that becomes a task not only in the late years, but especially in the late years, to let go of those dimensions of life that are no longer available. I would like to suggest that most often what a person has to let go of falls in two areas, two of those components of the life structure. And the one is to let go of my work, usually for most people in retirement. So I have to let go of what formerly was a major part of my life. And I would like to suggest that what really is demanded of a person is to be able to say something like this: I can let go of what I can no longer do well, or what some other person can do better. If I can acknowledge the fact that I can no longer do well what I used to be able to do, or if I can recognize that someone else can do this better, then I can let go of it. And that's what's demanded in the late years of life. But you may recall from last week, we said that it's critical for a person in the mid-years to develop a capacity to be a mentor, to be able to be generative, and that is to be able to usher others into the adult world, to improve the quality of life for others. Now, if I develop that capacity to be generative, to be a mentor for others, then I'll be able to let go of work when I discover somebody else can do it better, or when it might be good for them to move in and take over what I used to do. But that requires a great deal of maturity and a real capacity for generativity, which Daniel Levinson would suggest most of us don't have as much as we would need. I believe that this is really the great spiritual theme of St. John the Baptist, where he says when Jesus arrives on the scene, he must increase, I must decrease. That's letting go of what has been good, but now perhaps can be done better by someone other than me. So can I let go? Now, there's a second area of letting go that also befalls a person in the late years, and that's not letting go of job necessarily in retirement, but it might be letting go of a love relationship. Obviously, letting go perhaps of one's spouse in death, or someone else who has been close to me in my life. That also may be a kind of letting go that, like it or not, I find myself faced with late in life. And so the question becomes, can I let go of this person? Or have they become so much the meaning of my life that I can't imagine life without them? And if that's the case, then I will find it very difficult to continue on. And it may sound strange to say that, but what really has happened is one person has become too much, totally and exclusively, the meaning of my life, so that I cannot conceive of life without them. That's over-identifying too much with a person, even a person I love and care for deeply. So sometimes a person in the late years has to let go in that way, which obviously is always painful and always entails great loss. But that becomes the task. Can I let go and live on? Now, somewhat along these lines, I found very interesting a study I came across a couple of years ago, and it was a study conducted by the University of Colorado on loneliness in people's lives. And what they tried to do is they surveyed people all over the country and tried to get a sense of what age group has the most difficult time with loneliness in their lives. And what they discovered was not what they expected. Now, I don't know what age group you would think would be the loneliest age group, but interestingly enough, it was not the people in late years. The study suggested that the loneliest group of people in the United States are, who would you suspect? Yeah, exactly. Sharp group here. Adolescents, teenagers. They were the persons struggling most with loneliness, largely because they were still striving to form their own identity. And therefore, they felt rejection and disapproval much more completely than any other age group. So, I think what it suggests to us, if a person has a reasonably comfortable identity, has a sense of personal meaning in their life, then they're not as likely to be inescapably lonely. They will be able to have a sense of personal meaning, and they can let go of people a bit more easily. So that also is one of the tasks that, especially in the late years, we might expect to struggle with. Let me just add one additional comment to that. They also discovered that people in their late years, same study, were able much more to deal with the late years of life, 70s and even 80s, if one thing was present in their life, and that was a sense of religious meaning. A sense of religious meaning. If they had a sense of the religious meaning in life, they had an awareness of the transcendent reality, that seemed to sustain them in the late years more than anything else. That third component of the life structure. Let me continue on and just say a couple of other things about this task of freely surrendering dimensions of life no longer available. What is it that we can expect to see or to happen in a person's life if they are unable to let go? Well, I think what we see is melancholy, despair, and bitterness. Melancholy, despair, and bitterness. Now, it's more than just a sense of loss. It's more than just a sense of sadness. What we begin to see prevailing in a person's life is a deep sense of melancholy and a sense of despair and bitterness. To put it more specifically, what often happens, and this sounds real curious, a person begins to turn against the very thing they have loved. The very thing or the very person that they have loved and given their life to, because they've had it ripped away from them, they now begin to kind of turn against and become embittered toward. Let me illustrate that if I might. Had some experience working with a number of priests who have wrestled with the phenomenon of retirement. retirement from pastorates, from being pastor of a parish where they may have spent 10, 12, 15, 20 years of their life. And what I think is very tragic is often to see when these men feel they've been forced into retirement at age 70 or 75, sometimes become very embittered toward the church. In other words, toward the very reality they've served for some 50 years, all of a sudden they become angry at and embittered toward. It's reflective of the inability to let go. I end up hating the very thing that I love. And I think we see it occasionally in the very curious but not unusual phenomenon whereby a husband or wife loses their spouse and then actually becomes kind of angry at that person because they left them. Not at all uncommon. Again, it's a sense of having a hard time continuing to love the very person or thing I loved my whole life long. And that's the symptom we tend to see if a person's had a difficult time letting go. I would like to just share with you one last story, if I might, relative to this theme of letting go, which I think really is a major one. This is a story, very common. It's a story I mention because I think it's very symbolic. It's a simple story that was shared with me by a younger brother of mine when he told me about the first time he went water skiing. And I mention this only because it's highly symbolic of what we're talking about. He told me the first time he went water skiing, he did not have some of the difficulties that others of us may have experienced. For example, he said he had no trouble getting up out of the water when the boat took off. No trouble doing that. And he said he had no trouble at all maintaining his balance as he sort of skipped across the water. Had no difficulty with that. But he did have difficulty with one thing. And that was when he eventually did lose his balance and fall into the water, he instinctively kept hanging on to the rope. With obvious consequences. He was dragged several yards into the water and obviously ended up doing more harm to himself physically than would have been necessary if he just could have let go. To me, that says it well, very symbolically, that we do have a tendency in our lives to instinctively want to keep hanging on to something that was good and very helpful and very important, but has served its purpose. And now the only thing we really can do is to let go. And if we can't let go and trust that we'll be carried by the Spirit's movement in our lives, then we only end up doing more harm to ourselves than is necessary. So therefore, the importance of letting go so that I can live on. And that's the task of these years.